Actually on record.
Am I still your favorite?
Okay.
Huh?
Good evening, everybody. I'll see Harold. You always got to watch out. He's got that last remark. How you doing? Thanks everybody for being here this evening.
Joanne,
I know we got a few folks that aren't able to make it here this evening, and we got a few others that are scheduled to be here shortly. But I figure at this point we certainly have a critical mass to get going this evening. For the folks at home, this is a periodic and I think very valuable legislative delegation city council combined work session. I see we have folks from our school board here as well, Kent LePage, Bob Lister. So with that, perhaps a way to go is to have our city manager, John Bohinko. I'm sorry?
I saw the fire chief here too.
Oh, Fire Chief Chris LeClaire.
He could come
Always
up
ready.
and join us.
Very good. That's right. Very good. Perhaps we'll start with our city manager to do some introductions. Perhaps also at some point in that we can whip around as well for the folks at home.
Well, I think, Your Honor, probably for the folks at home, maybe if the legislative delegation introduces themselves.
Let's start like that.
And then we'll go from there.
Sure. When do we start? We'll start with you, Jackie.
Representative Jackie Calley Pitts.
Representative Christopher Serlin.
Representative Jim Powers.
School Board Chair Kent LePage.
School Superintendent Bob Lister.
Jim Splain, State Legislature. I was not elected chair tonight. They did not elect me chair.
Brag, brag, brag.
Paul McCachran, State Rep.
Laura Penelaka, State Rep.
I continued, Mayor?
I think everybody knows everybody.
Yeah. Okay.
But what I'd like to do, Your Honor, is go right into the education funding item that's on the agenda. But before we get into the specifics, which I'll turn over to Pat and then to our legislators who are here tonight, what I'd like to do, I think would be informative for the people at home, would be maybe a little background of what all took place and historical context about the education funding issue. When the statewide property tax was instituted in 1999 to help pay for education, Portsmouth led the opposition that resulted in the formation of coalition communities. We now have 34 communities from across the state. In total, donor towns were forced to raise $161 million in excessive property taxes to be distributed to other communities, many of them wealthier by every other standard, including per pupil property wealth. Of that, $11.7 million came from Portsmouth. The coalition has worked hard to encourage the legislature to adopt targeted aid, helping towns that need it rather than spending money to every community, no matter how rich they are. We also push for including an income factor in determining how needy a town is, and also to include extra money for English as a second language and special education costs. The tax is now very low. The unequalized rate will drop from the current $2.51 to $2.24 per thousand in fiscal 07, and we can spend any excess property taxes on education in Portsmouth. However, until it is eliminated altogether, there's always the risk that Portsmouth could become a donor town again. We believe the statewide property tax is basically a shell game. The state doesn't collect it. It's paid by local taxpayers, and in the past it's stayed in every town except those with higher property values, the donor communities. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court ruled in September that the current formula is unconstitutional because it did not define an adequate education, and ordered the legislature to come up with a definition by July 1st, 2007. The court said it wouldn't even look at the challenge to the funding part of the formula until there is a definition, but indicated it believes the state must pay for whatever it determines constitutional adequacy to be. At least 15 education funding related bills have been introduced thus far. I'd like to turn this over to Pat Remick from the Coalition Communities. She's the coordinator to give you a brief overview. Then I think it's probably would be nice to hear from our legislators to hear what you hear on the ground in Concord, and then open it up from there, Your Honor.
Very good.
What I've done is I did a search today of the legislative service request, and as the members of the delegation know, just because an LSR is submitted doesn't necessarily mean that will eventually become a bill. Some of them might be dropped before they're introduced, or they might be combined. But this gives sort of an example of the wide breadth of ideas that people have this year, and they include things, lotteries, casino, beer, wine, and tax revenues. There are several different proposals out there for funding, even though the legislature has only been tasked by the Supreme Court to define an adequate education. There are proposals out there that will go to the next step. On the second page, I've taken some of the examples of the education funding proposals that I'm aware of. One of them is a plan that's called the New Hampshire Homestead Plan, and because it was under that title, it didn't necessarily show up in an LSR search, so there might be some other hidden education funding bills out there that we're not aware of yet, and we won't be until they're formally introduced. I just wanted to briefly go through some of the examples again to show the wide range of thought that's going on up there right now. The governor has said that he would like to see another version of his targeted aid plan, which, as you know, was built on the coalition proposals, and possibly a limited constitutional amendment that would allow targeting. There's a plan that's coming in that was a bipartisan plan from some of the House Education Committee members from last year. It defines an adequate education, puts the cost at $1.2 billion, and it doesn't really say how they're going to raise the money, but gives several proposals or examples, such as a tax increase on second homes owned by non-residents, maybe a luxury entertainment tax on tickets costing over $50, luxury tax on items costing more than $10,000. I've listened to it be presented a couple times. They think that if they cobble together all these small taxes, they might have enough to cover the gap. There are others who don't think that can happen. Fred Bramante, who has been active in education funding but is not a legislator, has a couple people introducing a bill for him that would add a statewide property tax of $1 per thousand on residents, $2 on businesses, and $3 on second homes owned by non-residents. Everyone would be a donor community under this plan because it would go directly to the state. This other plan, the Andy Peterson plan, was filed as the New Hampshire Homestead Plan, and he's been pushing this already a lot before the legislature convenes. He was recently elected to the House. He's a former state senator. He would set a $7.50 property tax per thousand going directly to the state. This is one that would virtually put us back to a system it's even worse than we had before. We would be a donor town in a big way. Also, the homestead exemption only goes up to 2 homes valued at $200,000, so that's another reason why it will hurt all the donor towns with high property values. They will end up paying more under this plan than they do currently, for sure. It does have a transition component that would prevent any town from seeing an increase of more than $3 per thousand. And in the end, it would actually go to donor towns, so I don't think it's going to have many legs for the receiver towns. I'm not sure they're going to want to give us a break on that. And it sets the amount at $4,500 per student, which is far less than the average spending right now. Fred King, who has been very active in education funding in the past, I spoke to him last week about his proposal. What he wants to do is to change the language because the current education funding formula talks about equitable instead of adequate education. He would change it back to adequate, but also what he wants to do is include a reference to the Ed 300 rules, which I understand are about 900 pages of education rules that we currently have in the state. State Representative King maintains that the Supreme Court got it wrong, that New Hampshire does, in fact, define an adequate education through the rules that it makes, and that the legislature has oversight because these rules have to go before the House and Senate Rules Committee. This gives you an example of the various areas that people are coming from. There are a couple things that I just wanted to point out for the benefit of people watching from home as well, is that even if the legislature this year only deals with defining an adequate education, the decision that is made will impact the funding. And therefore, we as at Portsmouth and its coalition communities need to monitor it very closely to make sure there's nothing that's going to return us to donor towns. There's some people who are calling for an increase in the amount of money that is going to the schools, and some of the people involved in this issue are pointing out that New Hampshire students rank very high, at least above the average, and often far above the average on any statistics you look at on the amount of money that's spent per pupil in New Hampshire already. They're also on the outcome parameters. The New Hampshire students also rank very high in the testing. So there are people who say, why do we need to give more money when it seems to be an adequate system now? And that's something that the High Court has not looked at yet, obviously. Another factor that I think it's important to know is right now that local property taxes are currently funding at least 60% of the cost of education in New Hampshire. The most recently available national average puts it only 29% in most states. So we have a far higher reliance on the property tax, which I know all of you know. And the other issue that as a coalition we've been trying to speak to, it's not so much per pupil spending or a tax rate in a town, but it'd be helpful if the legislature is mindful of the property tax burden. And I have talked to tax assessors, and if you take the same house, exact same square footage, similar location in two towns, one a donor and one a receiver, because the property tax rate may be high, the value on it is low, so the sum amount being paid out of pocket is often less in a high property tax town, and substantially less, a couple $1,000s less, because we have in donor towns, such high property values. Even a low rate, the out-of-pocket amount is far higher for education. And those are just a few of the things that I wanted to bring about before we open the discussion. And I know you all have probably heard an awful lot already about some of the plans that I haven't yet been privy to. So look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Pat, you keep saying donor towns. Is there donor towns now?
At this moment, the excess statewide property taxes that are raised in a town that was formerly a donor town may remain in the town if it's spent on education. There are a couple communities that are pretty close to the edge in being able to spend that much on education in their towns within our coalition. Portsmouth, that is not the case.
But we don't have any donor towns, right?
Not at this point. That's right. The legislature passed a fix that made sure that there are no donor towns this year, and if the education funding formula does not change next year, there would also be no donor towns.
Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for that presentation. You actually are probably more up to date than some of us, because we have not, we have not started session yet. But let me say, first of all, and I think I can speak to follow up on Representative Splain's rather cryptic comment that he was not elected chair.
I wasn't even nominated.
For my sins, I was reelected to serve another 2 terms, so you can all blame me for things. But essentially, we all ran on a pledge to eliminate the statewide property tax and to eliminate donor towns, and that still remains our goal. How we go about doing that is going to be some time will need to be spent on that. As was said, the primary task which we face is we have to get done by July is the coming up with a definition, and that's what we will be working on. I suspect also that the governor's plan is going to get a lot of attention as for funding. Once things start going through committees, some of these will be pretty quickly, I think, disappear. But the committee process will begin shortly, and we will take it from there. I don't know if somebody else, Jackie.
I definitely do, because I always felt that I could speak for myself. We ran that we would not reinstate donor towns. We've already eliminated them. We all know, without dancing around the issue, and I'm always more outspoken, I think, is that we're going to have the income tax battle again. And we also know that the House and the Senate did pass the income tax once, and that the reason some of these other states have a low percentage of local payout for education is because they have an income tax. Now that battle is going to be waged again, and the camps are already drawing up. We passed it once, and the House, the Senate did not. They held it back because the governor threatened to veto it. We have to see where we're going, and we have to define the adequate education. What I do not want to see happen is that we take a figure and we backdoor into it, and we say an adequate education is $3,000. and then we try to fit something into that 3,000. Dr. Lister participated in a committee before, this is deja vu, where we defined inadequate education, and we don't want adequate for our children. We want much more than adequate. So this is an exercise that we have done before. But that's my fear, is that we'll take a figure, as I've seen here, 4,500 or whatever, and then try to backdoor into it. We can't do that. We have to come up with the definition, know where we're going, what we want, and then figure out how to fund it. And I think it's a foregone conclusion that we are going to have the income tax battle again. And I think I'm going to speak only for myself. As a member of the delegation, I voted for an income tax.
Representative Spillane.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I think Jackie is really right. The discussion around tax reform is still going to be front and center, despite different kinds of approaches. And it has to be. I mean, 50% of this discussion has to be how do you fund whatever we come up with. And we can't just talk about adequacy. We have to talk about excellence. What I'd suggest, and I've suggested this a couple of times in the past several years, but it takes somebody like you, Mayor Marchand, and the coalition communities to really run with this. I think we need to get this out of just the political and legislative process in Concord at the State House and have a summit of bringing together the expertise of all the superintendents, all the school boards, all of the players in this statewide, taxpayers, associations, business community, youth, people who are being educated or not, mayors of different communities, so that they can come up with an idea that is going to really solve the problem. I look at the other states, and even though many other states have different kinds of taxes to fund education, it's an annual thing. You know, how much money for education is always a fight. So I don't think that no matter what we do is going to end on June 30th, even if we do succeed at satisfying the Supreme Court's deadline and demand. What we really need to do, and you could do this, the coalition community could do this, and I think that's part of our challenge, how to do it. Bring people together rather than just allow a governor sitting in his corner office and 424 people who play politics and have played politics on this for decades, try to deal with an issue that probably we're not going to be able to solve.
One thing I would add to that is just earlier today I was meeting with the Manchester mayor, Mayor Ginta, and we come from different political party affiliations and different cities in important ways. But, and you're absolutely right, regardless of the numbers, you're dealing with the same general discussion in your Board of Aldermen, your City Council, your school board. It's the same gist, and it's true in every state. But it's two separate discussions, and I guess one question I'd have back for the delegation is, they're both equally important. I think you just said 50%. One is equality of opportunity, or access, equality of access and opportunity, versus a discussion about what the adequate or whatever the appropriate number of dollars is to achieve the level that as a state we agree is the proper level. Those are two separate discussions that I think if they're commingled, you end up getting nowhere very fast because they're both extremely difficult and complex. Either one of them is probably a legislative session in and of itself. The court seems to have said pretty clearly, you got to tell by the end of this session what system you're going to use, not necessarily the number of dollars, though that would seem to be a natural progression. How do you see the attempt to come up with a system that produces equal opportunity? Is that possibly going to be a separate conversation from the appropriate amount of dollars? How is that going to work? I'm very curious and somewhat confused as to how that's going to work so that by the end of June you're going to get a product that will meet the snuff of the state Supreme Court.
Mayor Marchand, can you tell me what you mean by equal opportunity? What are you defining as equal opportunity? Are you access to technology, to what's your definition?
Well, that, you may be hitting on the first problem is reasonable people who thought a lot about it could have different
definitions.
My personal definition is that the cost of educating somebody at the same level, this yet to be defined level, whether it's adequacy, excellence in terms of opportunity, could be wildly different in terms of the practical cost in, say, Berlin versus Portsmouth. And so it means the exact same number of dollars is not necessarily a fair barometer as to how many dollars of input you would need to provide equal opportunity. But a reasonable person might say, who the heck's going to determine what the difference is? The number has to be closer to ever reach agreement. So you may be reaching the first challenge is trying to reach some agreement on what a definition would be of equal opportunity.
I hadn't meant to say anything, but if you define that, wouldn't you then come up with the formulas to make sure that that money is distributed equally due to the cost? Not necessarily targeted, but due to the cost. If costs me $10 to educate a student in Portsmouth, it might cost me $5 to educate that student in Berlin. It might cost me $15 because I have to import technology. So wouldn't there be a formula then to adjust that and equalize that? And that would be on the funding side, not on the opportunity side?
My opinion is you would need a formula because there are cost drivers that are different parts of the state. But
That's right.
you guys are in the trenches there. You'd probably have a better idea. Paul, Representative McEachran.
The court has said that it's the state's obligation to pay for an adequate education, and they say that that comes from the Constitution. We all took an oath last week to support and uphold the Constitution. The easy job is going to be defining adequacy because, as been said here before, that's probably already been done, and there are bills in the bill coming from the bipartisan group in education. Tim Dunn from Keene is on that, and Kimberly Casey is on it, and that probably will be the vehicle to define an adequate education. Now, what we've got to know is that the property tax is not going to be the funding vehicle for that because the court hasn't said it yet, but if pressed, they probably will. It's unconstitutional because in its simplest terms, the state is the taxing district, and the taxing district has never assessed the property in the state.
As a whole.
Right, exactly. The taxing authority has never assessed the property in the state, and if it did so, it would have to do it at one time by one method, by a method that meant that everybody in the state was treated the same way. They have piggybacked on local communities who assessed 1 year, a different year, different times, and that case is presently in the Supreme Court, and it will give them an opportunity, if they need it, to just say that the property tax is not constitutional as a funding mechanism unless the state goes about assessing all of the properties in the state at one time by one method. And then the targeting aid concept really doesn't play with the Constitution because the Constitution says it's the state's obligation to pay for an adequate education. So then the legislature, and I suspect that this fight is not going to occur until the second session in 08. The income tax bills that are in there now hopefully will be sent to study, and that we'll have that fight, and everybody knows the only fair way to pay for education is through an income tax. And I would urge the communities, the coalition communities, to start thinking in a broader picture than just protecting themselves. I think we're pretty much free of the onslaught of donor towns. I think there's enough sentiment in the legislature that that won't occur, and the funding vehicle is unconstitutional to do it. So I think now is the time for everybody in the state to realize that there are only a few vehicles, and the income tax is the vehicle of my choice because it's the fair way to support any effort. Property taxes, not only unconstitutional, it's unfair. So hopefully that fight will come in the second session, and maybe we can do it in spite of what's been said.
Laura?
Please don't use the word equal opportunity, because they'll get a hold of that and take it to the judge, and he'll want to know what it is.
Oh, I know, that's risking.
But number two, I think that the prime thing that we're going to concentrate on this session is coming up with a definition of adequate education. And then the funding part of it will be, like Paul said, in the second year of that. But we need to come up with that, hopefully, that will satisfy the judges in doing it.
Is it fair to say that the way that the decision's been made, the Supreme Court decision, should be interpreted, at least for now, as from $1?
Yes, it's the state's obligation to fund $1 an adequate education. If you look around the country, there's no perfection. It doesn't exist. And so in the end, there's some wiggle room in that, and someone said, I think Mrs. Remick, that it's 30% from property taxes, which is the prime vehicle. There's also, interestingly enough, a bill in this year's legislature to allow communities to pass an income tax. That just gives you a little flavor of what's out there.
Wow.
A little bit of everything.
There we go, yeah. Oh, sorry, Jim. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In addition to what Paul and Laura have said, I think that the whole tax issue goes beyond education funding, because what's been happening, as you well know, is that the federal government has been downshifting things to the state, which has then downshifted them to the county, which means it ends up in our property taxes. So I think the discussion, while it's important to focus on education funding, is related to taxes, but it goes beyond that, because basically the state is being run on the backs of homeowners and renters, since they end up paying the freight. So I hope the coalition will keep that in mind.
Then I saw another hand. It sounds like one message perhaps to take home, a few people have mentioned, is that the coalition would be wise to try to find ways in which to broaden, and I'm not suggesting that would be easy, but that we're going to have to reach out to folks that are beyond the donor town, the traditional donor town community, to folks that may include traditional receiver town, I use the quotation marks on purpose, traditional receiver town communities. I think more Manchester, Portsmouth relationships, not instead of our existing ones, but in addition to. I mean, I get the sense there aren't enough of us, quote unquote, donor towns that even if we're all on the exact same page on something, that's not going to be enough juice to move where we want to move. Is that an accurate assessment?
Mr. Mayor, I don't want to say accurate or inaccurate, but I think that the coalition, I think the donor towns are gone and they'll never come back. Right. But what I think the coalition has to do is establish that grassroots type of effort within the local communities on the funding. I think what you did when you went to eliminate the donor towns was make your message very well heard. And I think that the local communities have to do that again. You have to build from the ground up to say, how do you want to fund this? Now, donor towns are dead. We're gone with that. Let's start again and look at what the funding methods are and which ones we prefer. And I think in each of your own communities, or our own communities, we can take that sort of grassroots and move with it. Because unless the pressure is applied from down, from the local people, I don't think you're going to see any movement on this issue. But I think that you have that ability. And you've proven it before, because your message was loud and clear to everyone. And I think that's where it has to start again.
Let me go with Pat.
I just wanted to point out, though, I think that the legislature has a sentiment of no donor towns, that when the court looks again at the challenge filed by the towns in Londonderry, there were two specific issues raised about donor towns, and there is still the potential, possibly at the court level, of some sort of a ruling that would not allow donor towns to keep the excess statewide property taxes raised within the community. So I think it's still sort of out there, at least at the court level. Though I very much agree with the legislative delegation that the legislature does not have the sentiment to return to donor towns.
Okay, Jim.
Jackie has given very wise words. One of the values of being a hanger-on in the legislature, as long as I have been, going back to 1969, is the institutional perspective to see the big picture of what we discussed there. Guess what? My first term there, when I was a little pup, the first discussions I saw were about education and education funding, and we had a governor, Walter Peterson, who was saying, look, we need to do something about this. And Paul McCachran even goes back a little further than me. Of course, he's older, but he goes back to 1963, and I haven't asked him. I bet that was probably a topic during that session. We, as politicians, all 424 of them, tend to follow more than lead. It's not exactly a great characteristic of politicians, but it's perhaps part of the definition. And it seems to me that what we need to do is see more of, to use Jackie's word, because it's a good definition, you work with the grassroots. And the councils, city councils, board of alders, the school boards, superintendents, the mayors can do a lot toward leading us if they had somebody to be able to bring together some consensus. You know, what we need is a statewide listening circle on this. I mean, listening circles are excellent concepts. And the idea is to get people to talk with one another instead of attitude one another. And it seems to me if we do some kind of visioning, we can take a look at the educational system and realize, boy, what we're doing now doesn't work. We're not talking about excellence, we're talking about adequacy and maybe much less. And if you could do that from the grassroots, wow, we could be looking toward a future in 20 or 30 years where we do a fantastic job in New Hampshire on education. But somebody's got to get us there, and I really don't think it's going to be the 424 House members and senators. It's got to be many other people in the state saying, you've got to follow us, the grassroots. You can do it, Steve.
Mm-hmm. Well, going to be busy tomorrow.
What are you going to do tomorrow? Solve the problem, right?
There we go.
Well, certainly we found in the last election, Carol Shea Porter being perhaps the prime example, that grassroots do work. And there has to be some consensus outside the legislature before we can come to consensus inside.
Well said. Well, at that point, unless there's something else burning, that's good food for thought that I think you're implying there's some action at our level that we need to think about and perhaps take soon. And I know that we've got other pressing issues this evening, not the least of which is the next one.
Right. Thank you, Your Honor. What I provided all the legislative delegation and council members was just a retirement system. There was an article by John Andrews from the Local Government Center that I think is very useful to take a look at when you have time. But I basically want to talk a little bit about the local impact that we're having in this year's budget so that you have a full understanding of how it's going to probably ripple out to communities throughout the state. Portsmouth alone is going to see about a $700,000 increase in its pension payments next year, or about 29%, which will bring us to about $3 million that we'll be paying out for retirement benefits. Now, I think it's important. This is such a complicated issue, and you know, I know there's a lot of people that have a lot of ideas about it, and certainly I do, and the mayor does, and I'm sure all you legislators do as well. But I know there is a working group that has been working with the local government center. It has New Hampshire School Boards Association involved with it, the New Hampshire Association of Counties, New Hampshire School Administrators, the State Employees Association, National Education Association, American Federation of Teachers, the AFL-CIO. So there is a working group out there that are talking about these issues because, quite frankly, this is such a big issue that it's not going to be resolved on one side or the other. It's going to have to be resolved as a team effort to try to recognize the problem and to try to address some of the major issues that are coming out. I know, and I did go to a meeting today at the LGC specifically because I knew tonight it was going to be on the agenda, and I think this working group is going to be meeting with the Speaker of the House in the future and talk about some of these issues. It is an area that has major ramifications for us as we move forward as a community. Between the health care costs and the retirement costs, it has major ramifications. One of the ramifications that I think you're going to be dealing with sooner than later is the issue of when the special account for medical subsidy runs out in 2011. That's going to be a major issue as well. The entire system, as indicated and many of you have read, is about $2 billion underfunded in terms of what is required from an actuarial standpoint. The one thing I was asked by the working group, and maybe you could pass this along to the Speaker, or I could maybe drop her a note, is trying to get information from the actuaries at the New Hampshire retirement system. That's been kind of the bottleneck. Everybody wants to work together, but before you start saying, should we, increase the retirement age, should we increase this, or should we do that, you really need to have an actuary say, is there going to be any, savings here? Is this going to, what is going to be the consequence that's going to result from that? We had an unintended consequence, unfortunately, in the last legislative session, where a bill got through. We don't even know how it got through, but it allowed every single employee in the system to buy back 5 years. That has done, in my mind, a huge amount of financial impact to the system. I mean, that 5 years, that means that 5 years, if you're 15 years into the system, you could buy back 5 years that will get you to your health care, your health subsidy. In addition, it does things such as if you're a teacher and you're in 30 years, you get to 35 years, it now reduces your reduction from age 60 down from 3% per year down to 1.5%. So it has huge ramifications from a financial perspective. How that got through the legislature, I've asked, and I haven't been able to find out, but it really doesn't matter now. It's out there, and I know there's a bill in there to try to fix that problem. I think that it has been filed, or will be filed. So, but I think it's important that this working group, and I'll be watching with the LGC to try to come up with some solution that's a long-range solution. Again, $3 million is being sent out from the city for retirement payments to the state, and it is a complex issue, and I think that maybe working together we can come up with some ideas. So that's where the local government center is, and just give you a flavor for how it's really affecting our budget this year.
And I know, sir, at the municipal level, we had a meeting of mayors several months ago. We have another one scheduled about a month and a half from now. This is always right at the top. This is in individual conversations. It's right at the top because of the potentially devastating impact it has on trying to balance municipal needs, services to provide, with the impact on taxes. So this is right at the top, even more so, I think, than ed funding at the moment, maybe in part because of the immediacy of the impact. Where is it in the minds in Concord?
I do have a list of bills that have been,
Yeah.
and quite frankly, there's a number of them that are going forward. The first one is the repealing the option to purchase non-qualified service credit in New Hampshire retirement system, the one I just mentioned, the 5-year buyback.
John, could this, seeing none of us even heard anything about this, could this have been a rule that was made by the retirement?
No, it was state law.
It's an RSA?
Yeah. And I can't, and there's an RSA in to repeal it.
Which one is the other?
It's 207H0064R.
I know.
It was sponsored by Ken Hawkins to repeal.
And you don't know who sponsored or where it came from?
No. I've been asking around. I haven't spent a lot of time on
No.
trying to find out. I'm more interested in trying to look at how we can deal with future
Because
issues.
Usually, the municipal association would come to us as legislators and say, such and such a bill is going to affect Portsmouth very
Right.
bad.
I think this is one that looked like a technical fix, and it ended up having unintended consequences that nobody
okay.
could have ever predicted. It was your own retirement tsunami that really ended up happening. And it is unbelievable the amount of people that have bought back that extra 5 years just here in the city. And I can just imagine how it's rippling throughout the state, from teachers to firefighters to police officers. And quite frankly, it's I don't blame them for doing it. I mean, it's available to them. So I guess my point is that's done. I think it's important to look forward to try to see, with this working group. I think the best thing is, and I know the speaker, like I said, will be meeting with this working group sometime in December. I would hope that somebody could take back the message that the one thing they're trying to get out is some information from the actuary from the state retirement system. And so if you could bring that back, I'd appreciate it. That would be helpful. So that's all I have to say about the retirement system.
I think you'll find it's going to be a big issue in Concord, very big issue.
John?
Yes.
Do you have a list of bills that are
Yep.
in that were?
Yeah, I do.
Could you email that to us or send it to us?
We could right now, yeah, before you leave, we could even give you copies, so
Well-
we can make copies, but, yeah. That one. Yeah, I could get it to you.
Can you get it to us? That's
Yeah, we'll get it to you. Okay.
All right. Other comments or thoughts on this? All right. We'll get that copy of bills coming up that are related.
Sure.
I think our next issue deals with the traffic circle.
Right, and
Circle.
for your information, when you received your agenda, I assume you all received a copy of the letter that we sent to Commissioner Murray. The letter is pretty self-explanatory. One of the things that we would encourage from the DOT end is that they utilize the option of a flyover rather than a signalized intersection. As I indicated in the letter that the mayor had sent to Commissioner Murray, there's an 8 to 10 lane at-grade signalized intersection that's going to be replacing the traffic circle, which will be a massive traffic backup, will cause, I believe, and I could defer to other people, but I think there will be some environmental impacts relative to that. We believe that that the better way is to have a flyover so that you don't have that significant backup. One of the reasons, obviously, is why they're not having the flyover. It's more expensive. But I believe, and from the staff perspective, that once it's even built, this 8 to 10 lane at-grade signalized intersection will probably be at design capacity. And so it's really not making any sense to do it that way. So you all have a copy of the letter. I would hope that, however you could encourage the commissioner to work with us very closely on that and to try to use that as a primary option rather than a secondary option, which they are doing right now. When we had our meeting here back in October, that was just a secondary option that they had not really looked at very closely because of the costs. And that's why the city council voted and the mayor sent this letter to the commissioner to encourage that be a primary option for the flyover.
And I think one of the notes, and you mentioned it, but it's worth reiterating, and I would argue perhaps on a pragmatic level, the most persuasive point is, regardless of the fact that a flyover option or similar option would likely cost more in capital costs, if the other option doesn't work, it doesn't really matter if it's much cheaper. You could, if we're going to use that logic, just don't do anything. That won't work either, but that'll be a lot cheaper than doing something that won't work, that will cost significantly more than doing nothing, but will be ineffective relative to something that would be a little bit more of an investment, and actually produce a desired result, and have a lot of residual benefits, not the least of which, like John said, was environmental. A lot of people that are idling effectively, rolling very slowly, waiting and waiting and waiting, and then there's a time cost to that waiting. There's a real cost of that can be measured.
Mr. Mayor, for the record, 50 years ago, the traffic circle replaced an at-grade signalized intersection.
It's old as new.
And now they're figuring that the modern touch is to go back 50 years, I guess.
That's pretty interesting. Harold?
How old are you?
Is that another word I've got to memorize, a flyover? Is that the same thing as an overpass or over and under?
It's a grade-separated access.
More or less. I saw a few hands are here. Jim?
I just did want to say that I did send a letter to Commissioner Murray in support of your letter. I have not heard back. You probably know she is under some pressure at this time, and there may be some developments there.
A few things going
We'll
on.
see.
Going on as well. Jackie.
Just a question, if they do this and consider it, will they come back with a design proposal?
Yes.
I'm wondering if the flyover would interfere with the business at the liquor store and the traffic circle.
Well, what they'll do is, I think what we want to make sure is that they design it. They are going to come back, and there will be, like in October, they come in, they do the full presentation. They indicated a year from now, from October, they were going to come back and do another presentation with their primary design. And that's why we felt it was important to get
The secondary.
the secondary as a primer as well, to try to show the pros and cons. They had a modeling program, a traffic modeling program that showed the effects of what would take place with the signalized intersection, but we didn't really see what would be with the flyover.
I just wondered if that would be one of the state's considerations. I could care less, but why they wouldn't do it, because it would interfere with business at the circle.
It's possible. Yeah.
People will find a way to get to the liquor store.
That kind of passion, right? Let me go with Ned and then Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak up and add my 2 cents on this one, because there could not be a more obvious example of a situation, a policy decision where, short-term so-called fiscal cost and the true, not even that much longer term, but more broadly construed cost need to be explicitly articulated and compared, and the right decision made. I mean, this one is so obvious that if the state's criteria is first capital cost of doing something, and if that is allowed to even stand for very long as the criteria of making these huge capital investments, as Steve points out, transportation infrastructure investments, you make that investment once and that's what you're stuck with for 50 years. And we just have to speak up loudly and early and often and get the state to see the bigger picture. I mean, it would be a complete travesty for that much money to be spent on what, as Paul points out, would be a 50-year-old, turning the clock back 50 years, not to mention, yes, John mentions the environmental, but you don't even have to just rely on environmental. You can say economic cost of people stuck in traffic. That's a very economic cost in terms of productivity and in terms of a lot more things. I mean, if you want Portsmouth to be known as the site of the greatest, most public traffic jam, so that everybody ever driving by on I-95 can look down at this unbelievably dysfunctional intersection, then that's terrific. And for Pete's sake, if the state needs a way to find the $8 million increment or something necessary to justify on their books the added investment, then raise the freaking tolls at the Dover toll booth, by 5 cents between now and 2012, and I'm sure that would more than cover it, and it would serve exactly the same people that will be coming down the pike and trying to get into Portsmouth. So it's not even a hard, fix to it.
Thanks. Let me go with Tom and then Laura.
I'll just see you and raise you and say that if the state goes off wrong-headed in that fashion and do something that stupid, I would certainly, as a city councilor, want to be as sure as possible that we as the city looked at every recourse we had to stop them from doing that. We've never been shy in that regard before. This is no different. So, nothing, as the mayor aptly puts it, it is what it is already, and putting in a large intersection there would be wrong-headed. And I hope that we can somehow get it across to them that this is extremely important for us, and we will likely not suffer their foolishness if they make the wrong choice.
I must say, let me get to you guys, but if it gets any hotter than what Ned and Tom just said, relatively speaking, we're going to need a 7-second delay to have these meetings. I was worried there for a second. I digress. Let me go Laura and then Harold.
John, when did they tell us they were going to start the project?
Which, you mean this particular project?
Yeah.
This is probably not out till 2012, probably thereabouts.
Well, you needn't worry about them starting a project and you having to fight them. We're on what they call a 10-year plan at the city, at the state level. And every year, I believe this project was supposed to start sometime in 2006, actually start. And they haven't even got it designed.
And I don't disagree with you, Laura, but the one thing you have to remember is eventually they get built. And,
I know.
And what's designed gets built. So that's why getting this designed right now is important.
I agree with you 100%, but it's something we can push for. But the money is not there for anything in the transportation department or anything else. Everybody in Concord is crying for money. The buildings are falling down around you and they're still not repairing them. So we're a very unique state. We have no income tax and we have no sales tax. So where we go from there, you can find out.
I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier. Let me go with Harold.
We have a bridge that's stuck in the air.
The true bridge to nowhere. Yeah, there we go.
Mayor, you mentioned in your communication to Mrs. Murray that it's a tightly knit neighborhood that this will be developed in, and a signal crossing would be a pollution problem, a noise problem, and everything. I think we should emphasize also the 7 motels in the area. And already at the Weeks' Crossing, there's one hotel, and there's already problems coming from residents who are staying at the hotel on a hot summer night with the windows open and the traffic and the screeching of the brakes and the pollution and the lights. Imagine with 7 motels in the area, just a few hundred feet from, this upper and over or over and under or whatever you want to call it, overpass. So I think an overpass is the way to go, and I think we should emphasize that not only in neighborhood residents, but businesses in the area.
Certainly. Kent, and then Paul?
Yeah, just a couple of notes in regards. There were a number of items that Bob and I were, wanting to be here tonight. One was to listen to the education funding, but also the Route 1 traffic circle is an extremely important thing to the school community, because anything will impact one of our 3 elementary schools. 11 years ago, and I feel like this is maybe our punishment, and I love Carol Murray. Matter of fact, I regret that she's having problems right now. She's been very helpful to the New Franklin School by putting up a zone fence that helped us in the past through Executive Council Ruth Griffin 4 years ago. But we had a traffic circle study that went on where a major type of retail outlet was going to be in there along with this, and seeing how the city of Portsmouth basically killed this plan, I think this will greatly impact, because you'll have diversionary traffic that will now try to bypass anything. We have the highest amount of impact in the hours of 7 o'clock until 8:30 with children going in and faculty and parents, and then again between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock with students coming and exiting in that area. So this is one that Bob Lister and Bob made a note. We will write a letter to Commissioner Murray, emphasizing our concern. I'm going to be quite blunt. I'm not quite sure, just like the Coliseum in Rome, I'm not quite sure why anybody would want to get rid of the traffic circle. It does not possess, in the last study, which was done 11 years ago, and that's why it failed 11 years ago, was that it did not increase or decrease the amount of accidents of any other type of intersection that would be there. So you have a very high volume of it, and again, I just have to emphasize, I'm not quite sure how over the 11-year period where we as a city killed a plan of high impact that the state wanted to sell some land. So please keep us in the loop, and we'll do what we can to pass the most safe issue that will affect the schools there in New Franklin.
Just, if I may, Your Honor, that project that we worked to ask the state not to put in had multiple impacts from a traffic perspective.
Correct.
Would have been really quite a thing out there. You would have had 3 pads of fast food restaurants in that circle. So,
But John, will this not free up more if they went with their light type of intersection there? You'll have leftover land, I would assume.
yes, if you went with the flyover, yeah, I'm sure there'll
Well,
be
with
plenty
the
of.
flyover either, I would think.
Right,
you'd have left.
but I'm just saying, the reason that we had concern with that you would have had 3 fast food restaurants exiting in or out of that circle.
Yep.
So that's why we were not in favor of that. Plus the school being that close. And
Thank you.
Yes, and I
Just
still
as
got
a,
the staff rooms to go with it.
As a point of context, when they originally designed the approaches to the high-level bridge, it went through St. Catherine's parking lot. And we were able to stop it at the governor and council level. Now there are more opportunities to stop something, I believe. So Tom is right on. We should clearly tell them if they're looking for a fight, they've got it on this one.
we're hoping that they'll go with our preferred option.
I think your letter says that.
Well, your words are clear tonight. Unless there's anything else about the traffic circle, I think we're moving on to the wetland issues, the vernal pools.
This came
some other
up.
issues.
This came up. I'm not sure which counselor asked that it be on the agenda, but what I did is I asked our environmental planner to give us a little background on vernal pools, and I did provide that to you. I know, Jim, we've talked briefly about this as well, the issue of vernal pools. As you can see, basically, under state regulations, vernal pools are a type of wetland and almost always meet the accepted definition of a wetland. Currently, vernal pools are not recognized any differently from other wetlands in the state, so there's no setback or buffer. So I think it's important for people to understand that there is some issues there. I don't know. I don't recall, like I said, which council member had brought that up, but I know there was questions that were asked about vernal pools, and I don't know if there's any legislation that is in relative to regulating vernal pools or what's going on. Does anybody have any idea on that?
I think there is.
There is.
I think Representative Spang from Durham has some in.
Okay. Well, this is a good definition. It also talks about what happens as what they are, what the state regulations are, and what our Portsmouth regulation is. So that's just more of an informational thing. If you happen to see the bill come through, if you recognize, could you just ship it over to us so that we can track it?
I think that was an issue, and I think there were multiple city councilors that, learning about the lack of legislation at any level dealing with protection of vernal pools, I think several of us were sort of surprised about it, and not claiming to be an expert in any regard, just sort of intuitively it seemed as if that was at least worthy of a discussion to shed some light on it. So it sounds like Representative Spang may be, if we learn the details, that would be great. I think there's a fair amount of interest in the council on that one.
Check it out.
Great. Our next issue deals with a caucus of the 13 cities in the state of New Hampshire.
Again, I think, Your Honor, I think you and a couple other council members had talked about this. I asked Pat to put together a list of number of representatives and senators from the 13 cities in terms of the numbers, not the individuals, and she has that information that should be passed around.
I think as this is getting passed around, and certainly other counselors, in terms of your thought process, and obviously the legislative delegation, I think to some extent, some of this relates back a bit to our education funding related discussion. That is that in order to come up with a critical mass of folks, preferably from both sides of the aisle, that would have an interest in moving in a long-term direction, it's going to require coalitions of folks that right now aren't coming together necessarily on that and other key issues. And I think this is one number crunching way to say, especially in light of some of the changes that occurred in last month's election, how many representatives are we talking about? Certainly no two cities are created alike in a number of ways, but as you see, the size of the delegations, comparing a Berlin to a Manchester and everybody in between, radical differences, and obviously radical differences in terms of impact in Concord, even if everybody rose together. So I don't know if other councilors had thoughts along those lines, but certainly as a group of mayors, we're working to get together. But that's a separate conversation, frankly, somewhat separate conversation from this list of the 13 cities. And for the folks at home, representing 14 state senators and 134 state representatives, certainly a significant chunk, about a third of the state reps, almost exactly.
And half of all the Democrats from the cities.
That's right. For what it's worth, the overwhelming number, particularly in the House of the Representatives, happen to be Democrats, and I'm sure that number changed dramatically off of last month's results. It's 11 out of 14, again for the folks at home, 11 of the 14 state senators representing cities are Democrats as well.
It certainly changed drastically.
That changed a wee bit, I think. Tom?
Just a comment, Mayor, and I think you probably know these numbers better than I, but there are at least 2 or 3 towns that are bigger than a number of these cities.
Right.
And, I don't know how that plays in, whether it's Salem or Darien, whichever, but is there a reason that regardless of what they call themselves, if they have a certain critical mass, I don't know if it's municipal bottom line, is it all towns above 40 million or all towns above 50 million? It doesn't really matter to me their governance as much as it does their similarity in terms of issues that they have to deal with, and I just wonder if it would be helpful politically to consider having those larger towns in.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, folks in the legislature, whoever. I think that's certainly true that there are a number of communities that are larger than some of the smaller cities. Indeed, if you go down to the smallest level, the Franklins and the Berlins, it's many non-incorporated communities. I think it's fair to say that most of them are relatively new to the party in terms of fast-growing southern and southeastern New Hampshire cities, Derry, Salem, some that those are Londonderry, that are not cities. But I think one other factor, and this may be something, is there a bill? Is there anything in the legislature dealing with these mega districts? Wasn't there on the last ballot flotarial districts? Was that not an issue, Jackie?
There is a move for redistricting. There is a bill that has to do with the way you elect the state reps.
But I think sometimes in that the towns not being incorporated into cities and whatnot have different guidelines than the cities do.
Right. And you're right, Counselor, there are different statutes that govern
Yeah.
cities as opposed to towns.
Joanne?
I was just going to speak on to what Laura was talking about. The towns have different time frames to get their budget through when they go through the town meeting process in one way or another. So I would say that Tom's suggestion is a good one, but I would first want to find out what would be the purpose of the caucus.
That's a good point. Indeed, I think kind of get my point of, if you look at the communities that are not incorporated as cities, but are exactly the kind of communities, the ones that are large, Hudson, Salem, Londonderry, Derry, and so forth, most of them are located in the same area, and my guess is probably, in a lot of cases, have pretty similar interests. Indeed, if to crunch the numbers, and unless somebody corrects me, a lot of the electoral change that occurred last month, that was one of the few parts of the state where, relatively speaking, there was not as much of that kind of change. There may have been a tightening in terms of percentages, in terms of a little bit of change at the fringes in the mega districts, 1 or 2 Democrats being added to 10 and double-digit member districts. But as a rule, that's actually probably one of the few parts of the state where there wasn't a lot of bottom-line party affiliation type change, and they are large. So my guess is their interests are probably very similar. I'd be curious as to how many of their interests, and this goes back to what would the purpose be of this congregating. There could be similarity. I can also see how they would say that we're kind of our own turf here, and we have turf to protect.
I would just say, Mr. Mayor, with regard to municipal expense, be it the retirement system, for example.
Oh, yeah.
That any areas where they have critical mass that's similar to ours in terms of amount of business they do and what their tax, how much their budget is. If they have big budgets and they're dealing with a large, police force, education, those kinds of things, those are the areas of similarity. Whether they enjoy the culture of town meeting is another matter. But
who wouldn't? No, but you're right. That seems to be one issue that is a dominant issue and only going to get more dominant, that I guess it doesn't really matter what the size of your community is. You're dealing with that on some level. Maybe different mechanisms for how you handle it. But, yeah, I think that would be a good example of one where we're all in the same boat. Jackie.
Most of us on the cities list, Rockingham County is predominantly Republican. But if most of this list of the cities, we will be meeting each other in caucus to talk about various pieces of legislation from each committee. What might be good is that prior to the committees really getting up to full steam, if one of the cities or the senators or someone call together a meeting of these representatives from the cities to talk about, or even the municipal association, to talk about legislation that is peculiar to the cities, that would impact only the cities. And perhaps the municipal association could call that kind of a legislative meeting prior to legislation being pushed out of committee. And that might be helpful. I think they do that anyway, but not on a regular basis. But before everybody gets together, otherwise we will be discussing amongst ourselves all the pieces of legislation in caucus already. But it might be nice to get a presentation from one body to as many people who could come to a legislative meeting. I don't think it has to be a regular caucus, but I think it would be very informative.
What did you have in mind for this caucus, or whose idea was this caucus?
It's just me speaking, and again, add, subtract, correct. I think it's more conceptual. Again, from my personal perspective, maybe because we've done it, and it looks like we'll be doing it with increased frequency. Also because you're dealing with pure and simple, just fewer human beings that you're trying to get in the same place at the same time. A conference of mayors may achieve many of the same objectives, assuming that people in my position do our homework before we head up there and talking with our friends in Concord. But I'm certainly open to discussion. I mean, there may be or may not be as many examples as I thought at first of unique properties of cities, incorporated cities, as compared to non-incorporated. And it may be that what you're saying is, not having seen these numbers before, that 119 out of 134 of the city's representatives hail from one party, which is something that a month and a half ago, the same conversation, you would have had a very different result. I'm sure it would have been much closer to even, I would assume. You have virtually everybody in the room whenever the Democratic Party's caucus gets it. This is a subset of that caucus. Doesn't mean you don't do something along the lines of what you said, but you're hitting almost everybody every time the whole group gets in a room anyway.
But if I could just say what I thought, and I didn't want to make it partisan, but it's true. We will, most of us, be together and discussing legislation, but something a presentation, again, at the beginning of the session, peculiar to cities. If there's legislation that's going to impact these 13 cities and the mayors think that this is important, it might be good to ask these reps to get together separately at a different time and say, these are the things that we think are important, that are on the agenda, that you really need to keep your eyes out open for in Concord. And I think that's helpful to most of us. I don't know how many pieces of legislation, but just looking at the bill numbers, I'm going to say there's probably close to 900, maybe more. And it's hard to keep track of all of them, but if you could pick out, or the mayors pick out what they need, and then call together these people or us and say, this is what we think, like you're doing now, is important, but do it on a larger scale, that gives us a better perspective. So that's all I was saying, that we're going to discuss the issues in caucus anyway, but it might be nice to have one presentation, but not a caucus that meets every month or every week.
But I also think the presentation should include the Republican.
Oh, and absolutely, if it were the opposite numbers, if it were the opposite number, you'd have the exact same dynamic going on.
That's why I said nonpartisan.
Despite whatever your party is.
That's absolutely. If it were the opposite numbers, I think it would be the same spirit, absolutely.
I have to say that we are, all these cities and towns, if they belong to the municipal association, they should be doing the work. They get paid a good fee from the cities and towns to keep track of this legislation, and they have all kinds of attorneys running around the halls up there.
I don't disagree with you, Laura. And again, I would have to say that the local government center is really geared towards the smaller towns because they're a resource for the smaller towns. From time to time, we as Portsmouth have had to go in and do our own work because, quite frankly, their bread and butter is, the very small towns.
But don't we belong to it?
That's a different discussion. I think we can have that at the city council level, and I would be more than happy to have that discussion.
Okay.
Chris?
I think there are two things. I think Jackie's making a really good point, but I want to pick up on what Tom is saying. I think there are other things about urbanicity and concentration of population. It's a whole different set of issues, and I can think of some of the things that we were talking about earlier, the transportation, sprawl-related issues, housing, and one that some of us around this table have talked about is just the issue of reimbursement for renovation or building of schools, and how the structure tends to favor towns that have different kinds of land use issues. So I think what Jackie said is absolutely right, but I do think there may be similar opportunities for just the urbanicity and population concentrations where we have more in common with some folks that are not on this list.
That's very true. Okay. That is it for explicit items, but we've got room for anything that either at the local level that we're missing, that you want to chip in, or from the legislative level that you think we're missing or critical. Harold?
I'd like to bring something up, and they're talking a lot about it in my circles that I travel in, and that is where are the road rage bills? I mean, a bill like many states have where a commuter can file a report when they're commuting into work and the same person is weaving, cutting, and tailgating and causing real problems on the highways. And this is not only commuting within to work, but going to from work. And there are some states that have a policy whereby you can file a grievance or file a form to this Department of Safety and describe the vehicle and the complaint and the time it happened. I don't think I have to tell you that coming down into Portsmouth on the Spalding Pike or coming up 33 between 7 and 8 in the morning or coming north on Route 1 in the morning there are some people that are really causing what I call road rage, and maybe I've missed it in the last sessions, but where are these bills? And I asked the legislature, has anybody been filing a bill such as this?
I don't know about that particular one, but I have put one in for cell phones and
Oh, yeah,
had
yep.
a member of the opposite party withdraw today because he had talked it over with the Department of Safety and the state police, and it's too hard to enforce.
Yeah.
So that creates a lot of road rage.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen any road rage bills in, but I have a cell phone bill in. So if you all want to shoot me now. I haven't seen any or heard anybody going to
yeah.
put them in. But you have to understand that New Hampshire is live free or die.
Especially the drive.
Well,
Yeah, we're still working on the helmet
yeah.
and the seatbelt.
You'll never get the helmet back. We had the helmet law in place when I went into the legislature. And the motorcyclists
Oh, yeah.
filled the building, the whole of Representative Hall and down, out the door and down the hall with solid full, and they repealed it.
It's Holly's.
But if I could just say something to Harold, somebody who goes in the Spalding Turnpike all the time, road rage, one of the causes of road rage is failure to yield, and we have laws on the books, it's just that they have to be enforced. Now, I was behind somebody tonight going 35 miles an hour in the left-hand lane and would not move.
Yep.
So I think that we have laws, and part of our problem in this state is the enforcement of existing laws.
Right.
And we have more laws than any of us know on the books, but we don't have enforcement to that degree, and we never will have. Because we don't have the state troopers and we don't have the police. But that's what we have to look at is enforcing what we have on the books.
Ned?
Yeah, if I could just chip in on that, I guess the thought, one of the, it applies not just to this issue, but perhaps other issues in terms of enforcement of policies that exist, or good practices. One of the aspects of that is making them more enforceable and putting in place measures that would help with enforcement. And for example, one thing that could help with this road rage issue is perhaps having a hotline that people could call.
On their cell phones.
On their cell phone,
Right.
on their hands-free cell phone. Several
But
states,
that's-
New York, Connecticut have,
Right,
hands-free.
And I see no reason why we can't enforce that cell phone law. They do it, they're smart enough to do it in Connecticut and New York.
Separate discussion, but,
Yep.
we could, so I'd agree with you on that. You can enforce it, again, if you sort of choose to, or put the means in place. But allowing motorists to report road ragers, in an easy way would go a long way towards having it be enforceable. Getting home and filing a form, that's never going to happen, but calling and saying, geez, there's this guy on the phone turnpike who's tailgating everybody and going, so if the state legislature can pass,
You can do that now?
star 9 or whatever it is.
You can do that now. I've called and said there's somebody driving erratically and you need, now, whether they ever get to that person, I don't know. But you have the ability to do that now, and the state police patrol those roads. So you can do that if you, and I've done it. But,
Is it specifically road rage, or is it
no,
report
it's
drunk
just,
driving?
well, if you see somebody doing, I've done it. If I see somebody who's driving erratically or who
What do you
I think is causing a danger to
you
someone
dial
else,
911, or what's the?
I'd dial 911 and patch in the state police and say,
People might hesitate to dial 911, but they might dial star 8 if they knew that was for that purpose. I'm just,
that's just a discussion, but you have the ability now.
Well, at this point, I heard multiple captivating conversations going on, which is one sign as we approach the 8 o'clock hour that we're probably at our end. There. Unless there are any other issues, questions, comments, anything else. One thing is I believe that we're going to work to try to get folks back together at some point in January, pending everybody's schedules, if I understand that correctly.
Just call it jamming.
That's right, the chair, right? Yes. Okay, at that, I think we're all set for the evening. Thank you very much for coming. I know everybody's schedule is very busy. Happy holidays to all of you.
Happy holidays.
Thank you for your work. Congratulations.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. There are many holidays.